Nice to see you.
Nice to see you
How
too.
cold is it in your in your spot?
It's actually kind of warm. It's just really wet. We have that like
Oh,
atmospheric river thing going on, and so I was actually supposed to meet with a bunch of my team today, and there's no rail service between Seattle and Portland right now. Like parts of the freeway are flooded out, and more rain to come.
okay. Well, fun. Well, I hope it gets better soon. Today we're very excited to have Boris with us. Boris Savitsky. Hi, Boris.
Hi, it's good to be
Um,
here.
yeah, we're very excited to have you here. And so Boris is, as you can see, the director of UX at Oracle. That sounds like a big job. How is that? How is that going for you?
Oh, it's going great. I'm on my 10th year. I'm a director of UX for the database Platinum Services specifically, so not the entire Oracle.
Okay.
And it's been great. I started there through UX transformation actually 9 years ago.
Awesome.
Okay, cool. Well, we're very excited to have you today with us. Catherine, who is usually the third host, is on vacation. Lucky her. So, we'll see her next time. And usually, what we like to do is start with, like resources that we found since the last time, or maybe not, but, like little things that we wanted to talk about. And actually, Boris added something to the mix. So, we're going to also talk about that. Cool. First one, basically, I wanted to share or reshare, resources that I wish I had when I started to talk about design systems. So the first one is called DES events. So like when you want to see meetups like or live streams like us, like there's a bunch of stuff. So yeah, I think it's a pretty cool resources to have, and never you can even I think can even subscribe to their calendar, so like you just know when things happen. This one is pretty cool. This one is design systems directory, as you can see, and so it's basically Google for design systems. So if I tap like buttons, I don't have like it's gonna like just give you like a Google search, but it's actually only for design system websites that they already registered. So yeah, you can also just look at 230 design system documentation. So yeah, it is a pretty cool resource when you're like, oh, I wonder how other people are thinking about, I don't know, elevation or date picker or what have you. So yeah, I think it's a pretty cool one.
The
Next
beauty
up
is
is,
definitely in the simplicity. The
sorry.
um, the beauty is definitely in the simplicity. I can't wait for somebody to like put an AI tool behind this that is starting to return like this is exactly how I should document my button or my do's and don'ts for accessibility based on the top 230 design systems.
Yeah, definitely. Next up, it's somewhat of a new one, I feel, but it's called designsystems.media. And as you can see, it actually can show you like, well, now they have like 500 videos. So that's pretty cool. And you can, oh, here we are.
Nice.
You have like speakers, topics, popular events. I think it's a pretty cool, it's like your design system YouTube almost, right? And so I think it's a pretty cool resource. Sorry. And the last one that I found that is somewhat new, I believe, it's called Design Systems Database, but it's designsystems.surf. And it has more of a, like it's a different vibe. Obviously there's like less systems, if like it's new, so there's only like 40 system, but maybe they actually select the ones that they're interested in. I don't know, but it's interesting. Directories, like if you're interested in color system, I feel like it's a little bit more curated maybe, but I don't know, I find it interesting. And so I don't know what
That's
blueprint
great.
would be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot that's coming soon in this, but there is this interesting idea about, how do you collect the best components that you've ever seen, right? And
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of good things that are happening with like open source components and open source UI, and having an aggregation point for that is neat because you're able to basically say like, hey, you know, I don't have to just look at material, or I don't have to just look at carbon. I have all these different resources that kind of push me towards how I build better components.
Yeah. Anyway, I think it's a
I
pretty
wish I
cool
had this
resource. Yeah, exactly, right? That's
when we
kind
were
of like,
building our design system.
yeah, that's the point. But then, and so Boris, you had something also that you wanted to share, which is Figma shortcuts. Can you tell us a little bit why you picked this one?
Yes, because I'm all about using shortcuts, but I really have a hard time remembering them and end up Googling like, oh, how can I do something? And so I found this website, and it's both for Mac and Windows. And to just being able to be more efficient in using Figma. And a lot of this can really save you many clicks. Even as simple as how to select one layer out of like 500 layers instead of keep clicking, 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 clicking.
Yeah.
This really is a helpful thing. But I do not know most of this myself. I have look it up, try to use it, and remember it.
Yeah. It's funny. One that I keep on using all the time, and I don't know if it's like just me or what, is actually, I don't know. I can't tell if it's there or what. It's Option L to close all of your, you know, like all of your layers to the like the root. I don't know why. It just helps me, you know, like sometimes I need like a fresh start. I'm like, just close everything, please, and then, you know, like I'll dive in what I want.
You taught
Yeah.
me something new. I
Okay.
needed this.
Yeah, I know,
I
right?
use the command / to get rid of the UI, especially during presentations.
Yeah, of
And then
course.
to
Yeah.
quickly go back to if I'm presenting several flows. That's the one I really use a lot.
Yeah,
And
I
just being
can't.
able to select like multiple elements. If I'm updating multiple components or multiple variances, to just select that like one icon that repeats multiple times. Just even that is very helpful.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, you know, try Option L. I think it's Option L. I always look for it, but it basically like close everything, and it just, you know, feel like I just clean up my my desk, you know, like magically. I'm like, it's fresh, you know.
I love
Anyway,
it. I love this shortcut. Thank you.
cool. Yeah, no problem. Okay, cool. Well, so today, Boris is here to talk with us about one specific topic, which is, I want to say, like relationships between designers and developers. Uh, and so, yeah, we should, you know, like dive into that. But maybe we can start, Boris, by maybe you telling us why you picked that topic. Like, is there something currently in your, you know, like in your work that is pushing you to think about that, or is it just something that you always love?
So I mean, this in my entire career, there's always been this like, how do we work better together? And like we spend a lot of time working with our stakeholders, sometimes our customers, our users. We create this often complicated mockups, flows, wireframes. We conduct a ton of research, spend really hundreds of hours on research, and then everything's signed off, and then we go and give it to developers, and something else is built, or something that's not the same as what we designed is built. This is the old story of our field.
Everyone
It's
has
nothing
solved
new.
this.
Yeah. And so it's like really like this ongoing story. And 9 years ago, I joined Oracle Platinum Services Group, and specifically to undertake UX transformation, build UX from ground up. And at that time, they were used to really developers doing everything. It's very common in the industry. And so as we started creating mockups, one of the things we found is that still translation was missing from the mockup to the code. And we had both a design system, we had a common components, so the developer version of the design system, but still it wasn't like making there. And what I actually ended up doing is we hosted our own design week just for our business unit, where we flew a bunch of people together and we had like workshops. At that time, we were actually moving to Sketch, so we had like training on Sketch and InVision. This is a while back, and then I hosted a workshop of like work better together. That is actually what it was, but it was a panel, really, not really a workshop. It was a panel of developers and designers, and we're just talking like, hey, what would make my job easier? Uh, and so we kind of talked about some stuff, and from that explanation, what we realized is the developers and designers are speaking different languages. Our components are configured a certain way. Developer components are configured a certain way. Sometimes designers don't know what is possible, especially when you're using common web components. We don't know what developers can do. Like, can you change the position of that icon? And so this is kind of like, and we start talking about it. We had a bunch of meetings, like we do like handovers and all this reviews and all this, but it was still like we can't be everywhere. And I realized I do have a development background as well. So I'm both UX designer and a developer. It's what happens when you're an artist raised by developers, is you kind of have some coding in your genes. And I knew both the design and development. And I realized that I realized how it's all the same. The design toolkit specifically is the same as the common web components that developers use. And I was like, what if we go crazy and just build our design system to be 99% the same, with even the name of a component is the same. So when the designer tells you, hey, use a button, it is like ABC button. It's the same. All the variances are 100% the same. So this became kind of like this endeavor we went on, and we found major success with it. And then designers start learning with the same language as developers, and developers start learning the same language as designers. We kind of got on the same page. And it really improved our inconsistencies with mockups.
Yeah. It's funny. It's really, like, obviously, I mean, I feel like we're all suffering from, from this. And for me, like, the analogy is, from the Bible, but it's like the how do you say that in English? Babel Tower.
The Tower of Babel, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, the Tower of Babel, right? Like, if we don't have the same language, we cannot build anymore. It's just like we need to talk, and so it's like it's exactly that, right? It's like if you don't recognize that if we don't have a shared language, then it's going to be like so frustratingly hard to build anything,
and wasting money and time.
Yeah.
If you build it wrong, you have to then change it. But then if users are exposed to wrong UI, they're going to start giving you feedback about why is that UI is bad. But in reality, do we take action on that feedback because UI is not built correctly? So you're almost getting this like contaminated feedback, which is not real. But then if you spend too much time in the wrong UI, then user is used to it. Then should you change it after the fact? Then cause like all breakdown of already developed mental models and memory of a user. It can really cause a lot of problems. That's what we kind of gone through. And we're like, okay, we need to fix it. And meetings are not always the answer.
Mm-hmm. When you think about that harmonization of kind of the design intent language and the actual implementation language and code, who really drives that conversation? Is that something that represents an equal contribution in the organization, or is that something that like one side leads the other on?
I think it definitely has to be one. Somebody does have to drive it, but also it has to be equal as well, because both sides are coming together and they think differently. Developers think one way, and that's totally fine. That is like their approach is to build stuff. Our approach is to design, and so I believe that we have to work together in a collaborative environment. That if you're about to go and especially if you're building something from scratch, like you definitely want to start together from scratch. So we are all aligned, because that says a lot. In my organization, UX is driving a lot of it, is because, and I'm not saying that's the right way of doing it. I'm a strong believer in process is contextual to your organization, to your product, to your needs and your weaknesses. Like it's needs, strength, and weaknesses. Sorry. And so in our case, UX is aware of all the projects that are coming in. We know all the user interactions. We have all the user research. And so rather than have somebody cipher through that data, we are constantly sharing it with our common component team. And so anytime we build a component from scratch, we get together. But UX writes the requirements from a point of view of a user. That's also another thing we do. We always try to talk about a point of view of a user. So, and remind like, hey, I know there's API limitation. I know there's some code limitations, but a user will not know about it. How do we make sure that that experience is seamless? But it is like, even though UX is driving it, we are still our equal partners in this. And if there's something we can get done, then we have to resolve it together.
No, that is interesting. I think that in particular, I see a lot of people like either tacitly or explicitly playing a portfolio management role, right? Like, so one level up from a product management role, you have a bunch of folks that are trying to say like, let's look across products. And especially this is common in companies that have scale, right? Is when you have not just one product team, not just 3 product teams, but like a dozen product teams. How do you actually solve this? And there tends to be kind of 2 pathways where the chaos looms, right? There's the one side, which is the people side, which is kind of what we just talked about, like who contributes where. And then there's the other side, which is like the tool proliferation problem, right? Where, Figma, despite their best efforts, you still don't get a lot of actual contribution from engineers in Figma. Likewise, within things like Storybook or things like VS Code, you don't get a lot of designers in those tools every day making contributions. Now, they may review each other's work and look at different things, but that combination problem of like the way that we think about the dynamics between people and their roles are different, as well as like a lot of tool chaos. And you talked about Sketch, and I remember back in the days where you'd have like, some corporate like Box account, and there'd be like 400 Sketch files in that, all named like something _final. It's like, which one of those do I pick? And then you'd similarly have like here's 45 different repos of all the different code projects that we have and all the different products that we have. So like, which one do I look at and which one's up to date? And just simply solving that proliferation chaos feels like a big challenge. When you think about like the people side, I think you did a great job describing like, hey, UX takes this leading role. We have this role to play of almost like portfolio management over our products. When you think about that tooling chaos, how do you solve that chaos around tools?
Yeah, so I have a term for that, trademark pending, is UX of UX. So I treat developers as also UX people. I treat architects as UX people. I treat QA as a UX people. Everyone is part of the UX. There are just different roles of UX. I'm not saying they're all UX and we're in charge. No, not at all. But they are part of our build team that is building the products for our users. We're all part of this. And so what I call it is UX of UX, which is how do you make sure that the experience, the UX of building the good UX works. So there's of course, there's different ways of doing it. There's no one way, and it always goes back to contextually and what it makes sense for organization, products, and such. So in our case, as long as you're using like some of like standard tools that everybody agrees on, so it tends to be pretty democratic in this way. Is that people just agree like, hey, I use this tool, what is the most common tool? And that tends to be kind of like, but hey, if you're using your own tool, but we have this other tool we prefer to use, and here's the benefits of it. A lot of it goes back to communications. Sometimes you have to mandate stuff if that makes sense in your case. Like, for example, should everybody use Figma? You're probably going to mandate that or not because you can share files and all this stuff. Everybody using the same tech stack. You're probably going to mandate it because you can have different tech stacks in the product. But then like bridging that between designers and developers, like how do I get developers into Figma? Well, the only way they can see my specs is in Figma. So there you go. They kind of have to go. For us, what we do is our Jira is actually like the common communication for us for everything. And so we have different processes for different teams. But in the end, my team every time we have a project, we include Figma link in Jira. So then developers, when they need to go through and review our mockups, they go there. And we prototype everything. We also found that by prototyping everything in Figma, that a developer is more likely to understand what are all the micro interactions that they have to account for. But the one thing we found is we put a bunch of text in Figma, it's too much because nobody reads it. So we don't annotate it. We try to really make it make sense from the prototyping experience of how things are going. But you can't escape documentation. I wish we could escape it. I don't like writing documentation. My grammar and spelling are not good, but that's what I do. A lot of it is documentation. And so like we found Jira useful for that, writing some documentation, but not too much. But also taking that and reviewing it with everybody. Like, hey, developer, does this style guide write up for how to use this component? Does it make sense to you? And if it doesn't, we need to rewrite it. So we're constantly, I think you have to communicate constantly with people and share what you're working on, get their feedback, incorporate that feedback, test it. It's really, you apply UX process to the doing UX and the tools.
Boris, just a quick question for you, because I just want to make sure that our audience also understand the scale that you're working in. It's like your system, like how many designers, how many developers are we talking about exactly? Because I'm guessing at Oracle it might be a much larger scale than all.
Yeah, so there's Oracle, and then there is like different groups, different business units. So its structure is kind of different, and it's pretty common in a lot. So Oracle as a whole has a lot of UX people. I think we have like 1,500 or more, maybe. Like it's pretty massive. But Oracle is also a massive company. We have hundreds of products. So my particular team is at its height was about 9 UXers, and it's both like a mix of designers and researchers. And then we also have a common component team as well. And then we have an overall like a UI development community. I think it's probably about like 100 developers or more. And then we used to also have some external development teams who were not part of us, but like follow like a federated design approach where they're external teams and they do something for us, and then we have to go through the review process.
I see. Thank you. And yeah, so that's helpful to understand, like what's the scale we're talking about.
Yeah.
I really love what you said about, like I thought it was very interesting to prototype everything. I think it's an interesting idea, and obviously, like sometimes like there's never like a silver bullet that works for everybody, but I think it's an interesting thing to try for sure.
We're constantly trying and changing. That's also the key. We're constantly iterating on how we do stuff just to be better and get a better feedback from developers on what is not possible.
Yeah. What I think is key also that you mentioned is how you need to communicate, and you need to communicate often, right? It's like, I feel like everybody, I mean, at least a lot of people that I heard, myself included, like is basically advocating for like not one handoff, like one point in time where suddenly like the designer work is done and then you just deliver it to the developer and say, this is, I'm done. You have to do it now. It's like, it's much more granular than that. I feel, like maybe at the beginning, it's 98% involvement of the designer and 2% of the developer. But in my experience, and as you mentioned, like the more you go prototyping route, the more, like at some point, like you can do some prototypes in Figma. And then at some point, you might actually have the switch when it's maybe like, like 50-50. And then suddenly it's more like on the developer side, where the developers start to actually build some proof of concept or prototypes or more like high fidelity stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so far we talked more about like from the designer side, but I'm curious to hear, once it's more like the, like the developer that is, like in command, how do they get feedback from designers to make sure that, they're on the right path, they didn't forget something, that was the design intent before you actually get to production?
Yeah, I'm really curious about this too, largely because there is this idea like there's the cynical take, which Christoph said a minute ago, which is like, well, design's done. Guess I'll call it a day. And that tends to be like the very cynical take. I don't think that many people really practice that. I mean, I've seen it a few times, but it's less and less common. I think more people actually really recognize that engineers and developers are making a lot of design decisions when they implement something. And so I think that I am curious, because this is where the loop problem happens, right? The feedback cycle about like, okay, so I have a bunch of things that represent intent in Figma, and that intent can be incredibly high fidelity as a interactive prototype. But ultimately, when those design decisions are happening in that engineering level, doesn't that just build up some design debt? And then how do you solve that design set by either recycling then back into the engineering side, or do you try to solve that problem at all?
So proactiveness is one of, I think, keys as well in it. So one of the things, like, well, like you said, like, oh, I'm done and I'm good to go, right? So we do, so we have official handover process. We actually, what we found is one problem we had is when people don't tell us when we have to do handovers. We're not project managers, we don't know. So we found like, hey, I'm going to create a subtask in Jira for the developer, for their story, like, hey, before you start, sync up and mention the person sync up with. And so we actually, it's very simple, and you would think like, oh, it's too much work, but we actually found big success with that. Developers said, oh, I have to do this. It became a checklist for them. So we had official handovers, and so what our handovers are, a planning stage actually. Sorry. Because whenever you're creating this giant amount of mockup, so I guess I'm going in the wrong direction, because the question was from development and how to ensure. So handovers are still really big important part. The other part that we found really important is continuous communication. So we actually have a weekly sync up calls or between designers and developers. Sometimes it's like for one project, but if you're a designer, work on the same project with the same developers, multiple products or features, then it's the same. You can use one meeting. And at that point, what the designer asks for is like, hey, can you just show me what you're working on? Show me work in progress. Because a lot of developers want to wait until it's done to show, because they don't want to get feedback. And the designers, they are trained to not be too overly nitpicky, but to notice stuff, to understand that it's work in progress, but also notice things like, hey, this looks a little different, or this stuff. So we kind of go through this where developer demos what they're working on, and if they did make a change to something, they demo that change, and the designer reviews that. So, and if, let's say, the other thing that could happen, because it's not always UI developers, there's also backend architects who'd be like, hey, the API does not support what you want to do. At that point, the developer may have already come up with a solution. We have to then take that, go back and update our mockups and see, hey, does this work with the overall style guide, with overall guidelines, and is this aligns with patterns that we already have? And is it accessibility? So we found that kind of this collaborative approach working. But then afterwards, so let's say we've gone through this, it goes to QA. But we also found that QA is not always going to be as attentive to everything related to UX. And so we have a process called UX QA, User Experience Quality and Accessibility Review.
Interesting.
And what it is the actual UX person is going to perform QA in addition to regular QA. And their job is, because they know the whole user flow, they know what is the scenarios, what are the tasks user need to perform, and they try to perform them. And I always ask my designers, try and break it. Do something that you're not supposed to do. Try and break this. And we used to have a refresh test. That was one of the breakage. If I refresh the flow, will it take me back to the flow, to the point where I refreshed it on? Or is it going to take me back to the beginning of the flow? Because we had that problem. For some reason, refresh would just restart everything. So we found that during UX QA, I've actually started this UX QA as a thing in my previous job as well, because for the same reasons, like, hey, I designed this, but developers are building different. But during the UX QA, we also have conversation like, well, how come is it this way? Is there technical issues? And developers say, well, yeah, I run into this. We're like, okay, well, then let me quickly update and review. Can we do it this way? So that is really important part. The other part that I also think is important, people forget about, and UX is not often involved in it, is planning. So when you build this giant 100 screen flow in Figma prototype, developers are not going to build it all at once. They can, if it's like they do monthly release cycle, or they do weekly or bi-weekly cycle, they can do it all in that short time. So developers plan, what am I going to build in this sprint? What am I going to build in this sprint? And part of our handover, sorry, is that UX is part of it. We actually take our giant mockups and we scale it down to just what the developer wants to build in that sprint. And then, so when developer is working on it, he's only looking at that mockup. So we kind of split our mockups from, we call it grooming, the first one, which is from Jira. And then we have each release mockup. And so developer is able to then focus on specific things. So when problems do arise, it's not this mountain now that stops us from doing everything. It is just a small thing, and we can quickly resolve it within that sprint. And then next sprint, it's not a problem anymore. So we found kind of like this UX QA, regular sync ups, and checking work in progress, which we call light UX QA. And then this planning, UX being part of planning, we found it to be really help to work with developers and make sure we're speaking the same language as they are.
It is interesting the way that you describe it, because it is still this place where you're basically saying, like, this is what you should go build. And one of the things that I'm curious about there is like, when you create something in Figma, you're not using the full potential of the medium that something is destined for. And what I mean by that is, like, Figma is innately an abstraction. It is trying to say, like, this is a lot like the web or a lot like my native app, but it isn't. And, you know, animation is the thing that people always point at. I like states myself because states are very hard to model. When you think about those design decisions that happen, like, what happens at the code level that makes those decisions, where it is a little bit less like, okay, developer, go build this. And that developer actually has to do something that is net new and innovative, because it's hard to model 200 states, and it's hard to model like an interaction where it's more than like a color change or a fade in. It's actually something that animates. Or another great example is you're using some device technology like your accelerometer in your phone to modify the behavior of a design. When you have those sorts of things that happen there, one of the big things that I always look at is, like, that is a design decision that is happening outside of Figma because you can't model it in Figma. What happens with those inside of your group?
Yeah, so this falls under the whole 1%. Now, percentages are just pulled it out of my head. It's not real. But yeah, so that's why I always say we're not 100% aligned with developers. We're 99% aligned with developers. So one of the things we approached it as, we have a common component team. They are, always I call them my UX engineers, but that's not their titles, but that's what I call them. Is they're engineering the user experience that then the UI developers are using to build it out. So animations, all the states, everything is built out. And there is way more that needs to be there. Now, one thing we did is, so like, let's say you have your UI, like there is, let's say you need like some kind of property for tracking if your user is internal or external user. Let's say you have that property, right? And they need it for some reason. For UX, there's no reason for it. But our actual Figma toolkit includes that property. So we try to include every single property that needs to be there from a point of view of a developer, as well as for ours. So one is the designer understands that that's there. Even if there is no variance at all for it, it is still there. And we even call the value of that property could be a string. So the designer understands what it is. There is nothing in the design system for us to change that string, but it is there. Now, Booleans have made our life so much easier to do that now. I'm like so excited, so happy with Booleans and state change. But we do try to mock up about 99% of every possible state of all of our components for our product that I work on. But you're right, you can mock up everything. That is why the purpose of just a UX designer trying to use the product, testing the product themselves, and trying to see how is that working. There are cases sometimes where we encounter like, oh, like the error message API returned this giant string of code, like half a script. This is a real example. And we're like, oh, we didn't know that could be. What is that? So we then start investigating, talk to developers, like, hey, what are some cases this could happen? So it really goes back to communication, talking with, but also training developers as well. Like explain to them, hey, whenever you encounter something that is not accounted by our mockups, let us know so we can work with you and help you resolve it. So this way, a developer or a person, really, it doesn't matter, developer or designer, they're not left to be on their own, thrown into the lake drowning. Like person should never drown because they encounter a problem. They should have a way around it. That's why I'm a big fan of process. Like, hey, I encounter a decision point. I have nowhere to go. Where do I go? At that point, we say, hey, just reach out to the UX team, and we are available, and we will help you. Or sometimes give them tools like, hey, in some cases where we encountered these problems, here's some of our solutions that we've done. I myself in the UX team, we constantly look actually at the UI that's produced by developers, and then we take it to our common component team, and we say, hey, why do you think the decision was made to do that? And we challenge the component team to think as their users, which is the UI developers. And we're like, hey, I talked to them and they said this XYZ, so we need to account for it. So we found that one is empowering people to solve problems themselves. If they reach a point of a decision, they don't have a solution. Now, they can't always wait for us to come and help them because you have deadlines approaching. So, okay, we say, hey, overall, what is our style guide? Our patterns. Try to solve that problem within what is already exists. But if it's something new, then we kind of have to go through a process and understand it. Like, what is it? Do we need to make changes? It goes back to planning. Do we need to release this feature with this problem? Or we give them, okay, go ahead, just ship it this way. And then we are going to fix it, because we can't always wait for perfect UX experience. And no project is ever complete. You're always going to keep working on it.
So I think that Christoph probably knows what I'm going to say here. But one of the things that I'm always kind of on about, right, is when we talk about that user empathy conversation and designing for users, one of the things I always find challenging about the way like most organizations do this process, right, is we talk about how we model things in Figma. And the reality is users do not experience Figma files. Users experience HTML and CSS and native code. And so when we think about designing for users, do you ever see a future where you would be able to actually prototype in code and build directly in code and circumvent that process? Because there's so many things with handoff that are problematic, where things get lost in translation. Yeah. There's so many things that are limiting about our design tools in terms of our ability to actually like fully explore the features that are and capabilities of our destination medium. Do you ever see a future where like it's not even that the disciplines are the same, but there's one discipline that is focused on the UX side of building with code, and there's another that's focused on like the deeper engineering questions?
Before you answer, Boris, I think it's interesting because we actually had a pretty similar question for Sean. Like if a designer knows HTML, CSS well, is it ever helpful to have the designer do mockups directly in code? I think it's
I saw that too.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting question because I've experienced both. So I, for many years, was both the UX designer and the front-end developer. Now, I didn't do like a hardcore development, but I would do HTML, CSS, LESS, SAS, JavaScript, all that stuff. So I did all that. So, and I know how to do it, which is why I'm the bridge between UX and development, because I speak their language. And not just because I was raised by developers, because my whole family is all developers, by the way. And so I think I think it would be amazing for a designer to simply be able to build things out and it writes the code. And there's already tools for it. I mean, if you look back a long time ago, Front Page Dreamweaver, they had that already. Like you want an input field and it's there. So like, it can work if you're building things from scratch, I think. Now, if you're kind of building out where it just writes HTML and that's it, the time where it falls apart is when your organization uses web components, as in it is like a string of code that then writes the HTML. And you can't always dump that into a tool that can write code for you. So if I do right now, if I use one of those Figma to HTML, or I use one of those places where it's just like drag and drop and it builds the code, my developers cannot use that at all because it is not written in the common components. Now, that's from like a designer doers. I think it is, so that's like one caveat of it. I think it is useful for designers to, not a requirement, but it is useful for designers to know some code, because being able to use some of those tools and to just build out your prototypes and test them, because you don't know, like Figma, I still cannot type in an input field. Frustrates me to no end. and sorry, it's almost 2024. I should be able to do it, but it's fine. You cannot 100% simulate an interaction. Now, should then I tell every UX designer should code? No, that's also should that be? It's different way of thinking. It's different approach. But I think it is useful, and I do see the future where Figma, ideally, and maybe that's where I can come in, or like, I mean, tools already existed where we could define, hey, just write the code for me of what it does, just for simply prototyping. Acture does it pretty well. I mean, they don't write code, but it can simulate a lot of really like nearly experience. But again, it's really hard to do, and you may not always have time. So if the tool can get easy for designers to do it, that would be great. But it's hard to expect it, and it's not going to solve all the problems either, because again, designer is not going to know some of the complexity of code, like, and designer has to learn how to do it. And then at that point, like, well, do you need the bigger timetable to figure that stuff out? But it would be great if, and this question has come up with our own organizations to do that. Like, hey, would it be easier if designers did that? But it really depends on if that makes sense within your case. But it would be great if more of my designers had some of the more coding knowledge that I do, to help them design what is possible and kind of understand it, and then maybe use the tools you're talking about. A lot of large companies have a lot of security requirements too. So like, you may not be able to take your code in some of those applications that do already do this. So there's so much complexity as well plays in that sometimes it's not always like a one shoe fits all.
Yeah. I feel like there's almost a philosophical question behind this, or concept, is that for me, like there's a tension between like a designer that actually know what is that particular platform able to do, right? It's like it can inform you of like the possibilities so you can pick the right thing. And I love to take that example from back in the days, when every website had, like snowflakes or sparkles following your cursor, right? It's like people were using it just because they could, like, so it's more about
how I miss GeoCities.
Count up how many people were on your site.
Yeah. But my point is that, it's like, it's not because you can do it that it's a good idea to do it. And this is for me, like the job of a designer, to know where we should be using what at what, like in what context. Okay, cool. So that's one. So I'm all for having designers that really understand the medium that they're working for. Like if they were, like printing a poster, they probably should know that this orange that they see on their screen is impossible to get on paper. Well, like that's part of that, right? On the other hand, I also believe in like, it's also interesting to have designers that don't know what's possible or not, because they can also sometimes dream big, because it's not their problem to know if it's feasible or not. And so sometimes, rather than like limiting them by only what they know, and then you end up in a situation where they just do like over and over again the same very simple stuff. And sometimes because they were misinformed by engineers that didn't tell them what was the breadth of possibilities, because maybe your engineers actually didn't know, or it was just a point in time. And since then, we created new stuff, right? And so the fact that you need also maybe designers to not know those delimitation, and like to be like, it would be awesome if we would be able to do X, Y, and Z. And if your engineers are great people, they're actually going to try everything they can to make that a reality. And maybe there will be some pushback and say, not feasible right now, maybe in 6 months, maybe in 2 years. But, you see what I mean? It's like philosophically, do designers need to know or not? There's like pros and cons about it.
You're absolutely right. It is a flying car versus a car on wheels. That this is, by the way, a real thing we use in one of our projects. Is you're right. If you have too much knowledge of what is technically possible, and you're working on the project to reimagine something from ground up, it's probably it could constrain you. The other possibility, a developer could give you information on what's possible because they've already themselves have ideated a solution and they think that's the best one to do. So you could also be. So you're right. It really depends on what is the context of your project. If your project is to reimagine of how you fill out a ticket on the help desk, then you may not want to know what is possible, what is not. You wanna completely step away from that. But if your project is like, hey, this is the design, this is the code toolkit we have, this is the only thing we can do, we cannot build anything new. At that point, you do need to know what is possible, what is not possible, because you may design something that developer can build, and then you can deliver it. It really depends on that context, and it's important to be able to separate yourself, and that's one of the things. Like, so we have those projects. So our product is very defined; it only does what it can do, and so. But sometimes we have this like, hey, we want to reimagine our table for how we display it. And at that point, it's all about working with designers. Okay, like forget what is possible. There is no limit. Just create whatever in the world you want. Then we take it to developers and then we work with them like, hey, can you do it? Because sometimes also what happens is developers get excited because one is they get to do something brand new out of like, oh, wow, this is cool. This is new. And a lot of times then if they they're our partner, again, they're part of the UX. And then they actually may even give you even other ideas, like for things that you didn't know, like, oh, there's this new technology, we could use this, we could do this. So like it kind of becomes, so you want to really invite them into this conversation as well. But I sometimes have to play a referee. I was like, let's not worry about what's possible. It doesn't matter what's possible. Let's forget about it. Let's see what we can come up with that's like crazy. And that's what we call a flying car versus a car on wheel. If you need to build a car on wheel, well, you need to know what the car on wheels can do. If you're building a flying car, you need to forget about what the car on wheel does.
Yeah, it's really interesting you talk about it that way, right? Because like there's the harkening back to the point before, right? There's the idea about like, well, let's just get rid of developers. Let's have Gen AI tools take Figma files and make them into React or whatever, right? And like for a whole bunch of reasons, that's not possible. And then there's the idea of also like every designer should learn how to code. And for a bunch of reasons, that's not possible. And I think that there is this sort of arms race right now into whether or not code gen tools are going to be the future, or if things that make code easier for designers to work with are going to be the future. I happen to be in the latter camp, but regardless, the idea of hey, every discipline still needs the other for now. So what does that sort of collaborative center look like in this, right? And if you're in that situation, I think that there is this sort of change in role that's happening in the design landscape, where like we have the flying car, right? Which by the way exists. I don't know if you guys saw this, the it landed in Seattle like a couple of months ago. But the thing that looks at like the flying car is like, I view that as like a design and technology innovation role, right? Like there's and like to not buzzword it too badly, but say, hey, there's going to be a bunch of stuff that is unconstrained. Like give me the ability to download a beer from a web browser. And like, that's a $1 billion company, right? It may not be possible, but like being able to dream about things like that is really, really exciting. And then there's a bunch of the building the car sort of things, which is this new design engineering paradigm that is systems focused. That's a lot of what we're talking about, right? Mm-hmm. And that systems focus, I think, has to be the predominant effect of the change in the industry. Like whether that's gen code or design to code generative tools, or whether that's like we make React easy for everybody to just have a visual editor for. There's the systems based approach, and then there's like that innovation approach, that flying car approach. And I think that there's going to be a split in this industry around that. There's going to be the people that use systems and then the people that intentionally are outside of those systems. I'd be curious if you see that same reality.
I think so. I think so. I mean, that's always, I feel like, is always the case. That end up, one is the UX industry has gone through hyper focus. Like we started as UX designers, then we start splitting into more and more, like, and companies have like just interaction designers, just people who do wireframes, just people who do interviewing, just so like kind of gone through that. And I could definitely see that yes, there will be people, and that's already there. I think it's already here. There are people who use systems, like design systems. I mean, there was no design systems before, right? So we were all kind of like these outsiders, copy and pasting from Balsamic file. Because that's what I did. And
everybody did for like 10 years.
Yeah, front page or Dreamweaver, you change a button. Well, guess what? There was no outside CSS file yet, so you have to go and copy that everywhere. So like, I feel like it's already here. Now, systems I tend to be more large companies, like Google using material design, Oracle using Redwood, IBM. Every large company has a design system, and they want everyone to build within design systems. And then the smaller companies, like especially startups, they tend to not always have it, though now design systems are becoming more of a thing. And by the way, design system, not just talking about the toolkit, talking about like style guides and patterns and like all that. So it's more to that. And so I do think it's there, and I think it will always be this way. And I think it's a good thing but for me, what I think is important is for companies and places where you do system design, that you still practice this outsider approach as well, because you need to innovate. And if you only go within the system, you end up having all your interfaces just be tables. Or all your interfaces are always the same. So that's why it's important to sometimes like, hey, let's just like not be bound by what we're doing. Let's just go be crazy and do something else. And then you find there's something else, this crazy thing you try to do like as an outsider is actually an awesome new thing. We actually went through that. We had a lot of tables. And but we found that our stakeholders keep asking us for just more and more columns. And at some point, it's just too much, but that's what they need. They're the users, that's what they need. They have valid reasons for it. We had to reimagine how we did tables to accommodate that it kind of made sense. And then we found like, well, guess what? Every record in that table has different data points. I'm not just going to have empty columns there for every record, even though it's not applicable. So we had to really reimagine our tables to be able to do it. And we had to take a step back, be like, let's not even use our design system. Let's just do something ourselves, like just for ground up. And then, okay, after I did it, how do I align it closer to the design system? So I kind of going back to your actual question, sorry, is yeah, I think that will be the case. I think it's already here. It's already ongoing. And I think it's awesome. I'm excited because I think system thinking is amazing, but I also think like innovating from not doing it is also very important.
Yeah, there's this exciting idea that I think mirrors a lot of like product market processes, right? And like my frame of reference is a startup company, where when we think about like what we do in product, we talk about how like 70% of what we're building is serving existing customers and 30% is widening the net of the possible customers that we serve. And I think there's a common philosophy there about like, look, like 70, 80, depends on what stage of company and what life cycle you're at, is about serving the experiences that we have. And then another, 20, 30% is about creating new experiences that are outside of those. And I think it drives really at the core of like, when you're using a design system and to take your table example, which I think is a really great one, and to say like, how much do I extend this table before it's unrecognizable from the original intent of that table? And at what point is that not an extension, it's a recreation? There's a sort of like a ship of Theseus thing going on with a lot of components that are out there in the wild, because different product teams or different groups want to continually extend them beyond their initial design or their initial intent. And there's a lot that has to do with composability there that I think is a really interesting topic. When you think about the idea about like, how do I create new experiences in new UI? Do you think about that composability of experience, or is it more like the table where you're trying to say like, there's a point where this is no longer a table. There's a point where this is something different. and we need to call it that different thing?
I think I always go back to this context. Like for us, table is a big thing. It's everywhere. And at some point we like even said like, oh my goodness, just everything is a table. But it also works well, and the users know it, and they have the same expected mental model of using it in one place, and then they're using it in the same way. But I do think that it can also be a constraint, that you're not innovating really, and yeah, and maybe it's not a table anymore. That's also, for us, it's also came up like, is this really still a table? The only reason we call it a table is because from development point of view, it is the same component.
Right.
It's just a property that changes is it. And so we're like, oh, you know what? We speak the same language, so we are going to call it a table. We call it the summary table. Actually, that's our like new table concept. It's nothing revolutionary, really. But yeah, you kind of have to always look at it like, what makes sense for you, and also what makes sense for your users as well. Like, if you go and decide to, you know what, I've been using table too much, I want to introduce this new pattern. Is it beneficial to your users? Like, oh, is it going to create a bump in their experience and be like, what is this? Especially if your user has a repetitive action, hundreds of actions. This is what we deal with. While we have users that constantly do repetitive actions, and we're trying to make them more efficient at it. And if I introduce something that is not a table, it may actually not startle them, that's a little extreme, but it may stop them. Be like, oh, I have to learn something new. So anytime we reimagine components, I always worry about that. Like, hey, am I gonna impact the existing user experience of a user, even if it's a brand new feature? If it's the same user who's using my other features and they're coming in, I have to be concerned about it. Like, hey, am I going to interrupt it? Now, question could be like, well, when we've done our table reimagining, we took it to the users and we tested it with them. We've done some crazy stuff in it, and then our users were like, oh, this is too different. I don't like this. And we're like, okay, well, let's maybe scale it down, but then slowly try to introduce some of those features. So you always have to really think about it. Like, does it make sense for you to reimagine something from ground up? For both yourself, like developers, if I replace my table, I have to have every developer on every project go replace it. So that's technical debt. I'm creating technical debt, which is not going to be so good. Then I'm also creating design debt because I have to have every designer go replace that. That's also not good. But then I also have to have users be impacted by it because I'm adding something new. It's always like, you have to be careful. Now, the way I've approached this is like, we're reimagining stuff, but we use existing components. We're building all the building blocks, all the atoms of all this like the summary table. We're still using some table controls. We're using a panel instead of columns. That's a panel that exists everywhere else. We use like same pattern as label. So we're using the same elements. So even though I'm introducing something new and reimagine it, it's built out of the elements that the user already been exposed to in our product, to just diminish that impact on the users. And then, but you have to always talk to developers like, hey, if I do this, what is the impact on you? How much work it is? One cool thing we've done, so again, it's all about tables. Well, we had a table 1.0, then we had a table 2.0, and table 2.0 was a completely new thing. So I had this awesome developer on the team. He wrote a code plugin that rewrote, you paste your code for your table 1 and it rewrote it into table 2.0. I mean, that was amazing. So we reduced that barrier of a developer of converting to using a new components. But you have to talk to development about it. Like, how can I make it easier for you to adopt this, which is brand new, and it's going to add the technical debt? Because if you go back to a dev manager, it's going to say, no, I'm not doing technical debt because that's more work for me. I don't know if I end up answering a different question.
No, I mean, it was a meandering path, but it was
Sorry.
So I just want to say, like, hey, I really appreciate you taking the time to jump on today and to talk with us, share your knowledge. Fun conversation, really insightful, and I love all the things that we got to talk about and challenge. It was awesome.
Yeah, agree.
It's a pleasure.
Big plus one there. Thank you very much, Boris. We're almost at time, so it was great to have you on board and talk about all this stuff. And I hope we'll see you again to another episode.
Cool.
Likewise. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you
Take
very
care.
much.
See you later,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.